Welcome to Socrates Garrett Live. We're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi, in the heart of the deep, deep South, where there's troubled waters, where there's discouragement and people that are talking about one another, and local elected officials are having public disagreements and fallouts, and talk radio shows are talking about how backwards and ignorant black folk are on a daily basis in Jackson, Mississippi. You know, these are probably the worst times that I've seen in a long, long time. You know, I thought that after Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and the Vernon Damon gave their lives, that we might have an opportunity to govern ourselves and improve our status and our quality of life, that we were on our way upward. I knew that we had been tricked by integration, but I thought we had fought our way through it, and we got to the ballot box, and we were doing the kinds of things that were going to allow us to put our people in positions that could make our communities better. But it saddens me today to report that that's not the case. That if we don't correct things here today, then all of the tragedy and all of the lives that were destroyed and all of the families that were destroyed trying to uplift the black man would have died in vain. If we don't figure out a way to come together and corral our leadership and put some discipline in this army, then we don't have a chance of surviving. You know, more of our people now are dying from friendly fire than they are from our oppressor. This is a moment in time in history in Mississippi and throughout this country that we must take a stand. We must call it like it is. As Tisdale, the founder, or well, not the founder, but the publisher of the Jackson Advocates said, we must call it like it is, whether it pinches or comforts. Stephanie Parker Weaver, another warrior soldier that has gone on, said we got to speak truth to power. You know, the opportunity for good men to stand up and be heard now is in front of you. The crisis situation is here. Normally in a crisis, you will have some leaders that rise up. And we need to see them today more than ever before. We need to see local leadership. We don't need to see Jesus. We need to see local leadership stand up in our community. Now, Mississippi has a terrible, terrible history of the way it treated African Americans. And it was done during the years of slavery. And yes, those were tough times. Many African Americans were sharecroppers and were never, ever able to uplift their families because they could never get out of debt at the country store. And so things were rough. But today things have gotten rougher. So I'm here, we're broadcasting live. You can find us on YouTube, on Roku TV, on WeBelieveDigital.com, on Facebook, and we're being broadcast all over the world. So I hope that all of the Palestinians and the Israelis are watching this broadcast and know that their struggle is akin to the struggle that African Americans have been fighting in this country for over 200 years. Now, you can join this conversation by calling 800-492-5186. If you're watching us on the website, you see the donate button there. It takes money to put these programs on, and it takes courage. So you see the donate button there. Share with us. Hit the donate button. Share the program with your friends and family. If you'd like to make a contribution, just go to our website and make a contribution to this program. We need your help, but we got to get this word out. Mississippi legislature just voted that critical race theory would not be taught in Mississippi. The history of Mississippi would not be shared with Mississippi children of today. And so the attempt is being made to rewrite the past, to write it in a way where African Americans have not been treated the way they have been mistreated throughout this entire century. And my co-host and guest, as always, is the Honorable Dr. Eldridge Henderson, a man that is a renowned public speaker, a man that has lived throughout this period of time that we're discussing today, a man that is educated, but he's also street smart, a man that was born on the plantation. Those of you that think you have risen above and gone beyond, you got to remember how close you are to being back on the plantation. You're just days away from that. Dr. Henderson has said to us that if we don't do a few things and do them right now, that we will become totally irrelevant as a race, and that we will be the outcast of the entire world. Dr. Henderson, it's good to have you here with us today. And I want to ask you to share with our viewers a little bit about who you are and where you came from.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Garrett. I'm pleased to be here again. Well, I'm from Bolton, Mississippi. The last 70-some years, I've lived in the Bolton area and many other places. Atlanta, Georgia, Utah. I've also had a chance to move to what we call an overseas area, Vietnam veteran, over there in Vietnam for about a year. I've had an opportunity to live in Florida, and I visited the great city of Chicago once for 2 or 3 days. But most of my time, Mr. Garrett, has been on the great shores of the Mississippi River, right here in Hinds County. And also had an opportunity to do some things and live a life that was tough and didn't know it. And that was the 17 years I lived on that plantation. I was able to get free room and board. I always had a job, and I had a guaranteed education up to the 8th grade. And at that point, I knew I had it made because I was already told by the plantation owner, when you finish the 8th grade, I'm going to give you a house and a job. And I've been telling this true story for years. And that's exactly what he had planned for me. I had a regular house that he owned. He had 10 or 15 tractors, so I had my own tractor. And my job was to bale hay, work in the fields with the tractor, keep the fence fixed. And if I did that, he was going to give me a good guaranteed salary of $2 a day. Now that's what an 8th grade education. No other skills. Didn't know anything about Jackson, Mississippi. We only visited Jackson, Mississippi 2 or 3 times during the 17 years we were on the plantation. We had no reason to move to Jackson or go to Jackson because we didn't have any money. We would go to the country store and get our food, all the supplies we need. If an animal would die, we'd go and get an animal, a mule or a horse. If you need equipment, you could get all that on the plantation. And they were so nice to us, Mr. Socrates, we didn't even have to put up anything but our bodies. No collateral. Just say it. I want this, boss. Boss will give it to you, and you didn't have to sign for it. And you say, go on, and I'll see you at settlement time. I went through that with my dad and my family for 17 years and didn't know it was a bad deal because everyone in that community that I knew, because we were totally in segregation, lived the same way. And we were happy. We were not sad. We had an opportunity to go to church several times a week, and especially on Sundays, Sunday school, regular church service. And if you had an evening program, you would take fried chicken, salad, and potato pie in boxes and bags, eat that, and then have that evening service on a Sunday. And that's when all the young kids were given an opportunity to sing, do some praise dancing, or recite a poem. That's all I knew until I was 17. Didn't have any fears because I knew two things: work and work. That's all I knew. So that's the history of Eldridge Henderson until I got enlightened when I got involved in the military. That changed my perspective on life.
So, Dr. Henderson, you've come through some difficult times, and yet here we are today. How do you assess where we are today versus where you came from?
Well, it's worse. I guarantee you it's worse. Now, when people hear me say it's worse today than it was when I came along, from 1 to 17 years of age, I told you just a few minutes ago, Mr. Socrates, that I was guaranteed a job, we were guaranteed a house, and we were guaranteed an economic wherewithal, where if we had a need for some money or equipment or supplies, they were given to us and we had to pay for it later. Today, you're not guaranteed a job. If you can't pay your rent, you're not guaranteed a house. And you most certainly can't go to the store and get things, even on an installment, because in just a few years, most of the poor people, black and white, are not going to have the money to even buy anything on installment. So in just about 8 years or so, unless black people in America and the world start unifying themselves, forming networks and coalitions, they're going to be worse off than the Native Americans are today. And they are in bad shape, sir.
What happened to the Native Americans?
Well, the Native Americans were too friendly with their visitors back in the 1500s. Too friendly. They allowed their visitors to come on their shores. And those visitors were friendly, nice, kind, considerate. They shared their resources with the colonial types. They just thought they were a strange people coming by to see them. They didn't know they had another intent, to come in and take their land, take their women, take all their property, and then accuse them to be savages and non-religious, call them lazy, and all kinds of things, and ended up putting those so-called Native Americans in slavery after they say they discovered the country.
They were passionate people, and we find ourselves as African Americans being religious, passionate people.
That's correct.
Will those two things there force us to have the same demise?
I guarantee you, you don't even have to go any farther. I tell you, it will. If the black people in America don't get what I call a more militant and radical religious perspective and make an announcement that they are similar to God, that they are going to determine our destiny, they're going to have standards, right and wrong, and that we're going to be men again, and we're going to defend our honor, our family, and our country and territory. That's what we're going to have in the next decade or so, or we'll be in demise continuously, and it's going to get worse every decade in America.
We will be men again.
That's a fact.
That sounds like you're saying that we're not men today.
No, we're not. We are parasites now, basically. I'm talking about the black people that are in positions of responsibility. If you look at any position a black person is in Mississippi, in the South, and in the nation, in very few instances, and we have researched this, they cannot give the final word on what is going to be produced, bought, or sold, even in their area of responsibility, every major decision is going to have to be made by a board of control or the president or the chairman of the board, even though the black person might be the president, or he might be the co-chairman, or he might be on the board of directors. Not in one instance where you find a black person in America that I know about has the ultimate control to decide what's going to be purchased, who is going to be hired, and who's going to be fired. It's always a recommendation.
How can you say that when black people currently control the government in Hinds County in Jackson, Mississippi, where the city mayor is black, the council is majority black, the school board is majority black, the airport authority is majority black? Black folk should be in a position of power that can control their own destiny.
Well, that's partially correct. You are 50% correct, sir. Black people are in an illusion of power. They control over $1 billion in Hinds County, but they don't have the ability to spend that money where they can help other black people. If they had to spend $400,000, $15 million, $800,000 or whatever, they have to go to the other side to find the specialists that they need to perform the task. They have been brainwashed to the point where most of the black politicians in Mississippi, in the nation, are saying that we can't find enough qualified black people to do anything. And if we could, we couldn't give them major responsibility because we have a quota system. And they are using the quota system that the white people used before they got in power. 10% on the books and give the blacks about 1 to 2% of the resources that the county and the city had. And the black politicians are doing the same thing today, the same thing. And believe it or not, Mr. Socrates, they have also put some of the black people that have been in the contracted business on a blacklist because they don't have the ability to forgive one when he or she will support one of their opponents when they're running for supervisor, for mayor, or the city council, or governor in the respective states.
Now, is this a Mississippi trait of African Americans, or is this more widespread? Do African Americans act the same way in Illinois and in Missouri?
All over the place where the African Americans are. Wherever you find an African American, he or she is not totally independent. Even these district attorneys and the few state attorneys, they are not independent.
So how does one gain their independence? How can a black man achieve a position and a status in life where he can be a man again, where he's not compromised, he's not bought, and he's not bowed? How do we get our men especially back in that posture?
It's very simple. Black people are going to have to look at where they are economically and politically and look at the location they are in, and whenever and wherever they are in the majority, they're going to have to pool their resources, form networks, change their political thinking, and decide that we're going to create our own leaders, do our best to gradually wipe out most of the elected and appointed black officials, including the preachers and the corporate leaders that work at these banks, and put our own people in those positions. But we have to train them first, and they must be trained in the educational institutions that's going to be directed by the churches and the various large denominations, the black church denomination. That's the only way black folks are going to be saved, because the present structure in the public schools, and especially on the higher education level, are designed to maintain and promote the status quo, where you find the brightest black person, give him or her a scholarship, give them a position of so-called responsibility as an assistant somewhere in the college system, the student council, but not the president of the student council, give them a lot of recognition on the football and basketball team, but most don't graduate. The good ones always leave before they graduate, during the junior, senior year, and go pro. They haven't taught them how to manage the money, and they always have a plan, and I know this from research and from people I've talked to, where if a black man in the industry where money is being made, the people that promote this black man or woman going to always have a scheme together where they're going to end up with the money. And in most cases, especially with athletes, they have a design when they're in high school. When they start recruiting those guys and girls, they always have a tutor for them or an assistant, and if it's a male, it's usually a white female.
Well, we got a lot of work to do. We're on a commercial break coming up, but we got to talk about how we liberate our African American men and how we move them back into a position of relevance, how we move them back into a position of authority. And when you're in those positions, how you understand that your role and your job specifically is to look out for the welfare of the community that sent you there. It's nothing new. It's how other ethnic groups operate on a day-to-day basis, but it does not happen in our community. We're up against a station break, and we'll be right back for the second segment of Socrates Garrett Live. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Socrates Garrett Live. You can call us at 800-492-5186 to join in this conversation. We're being seen all over the world. We're in every state in America. We're being seen in Italy, in Rome. We're being seen in Vietnam. We're all over the world. You can find us on YouTube, on Roku TV, on WeBelieveDigital.com, and on Facebook. You know, it's important that we get the word out and get the message out, the crying call that African Americans must take a stand. Today is the day that African Americans must take a stand to change the direction in which their race and the community is currently going. Now, many of you are aware of Mississippi's history, and yes, it is not something to be proud of. You know, Mississippi is a garden state in terms of its geographical location, in terms of the climate that we're in. In Jackson, Mississippi, we have two major interstates that intersect here, Interstate 55 and 20, running north and south and east and west. We should be a transportation hub. in Jackson, Mississippi, you know, the opportunities for this land to be a mecca more so than Mobile and Birmingham and Montgomery and Birmingham. This is the place that we should have grown. We have the mighty Pearl River that runs down through our city, and we have the mighty Mississippi River that runs along our western border. Our port should be really flourishing. The port in Vicksburg should be a major economic engine. And yet, in Mississippi, we remain last. We remain last in health care. We remain last in our economies. We are the poorest and fattest people in the entire country. Something is wrong. I'm talking with my co-host, Dr. Eldridge Henderson, and we've got to figure out what is wrong. Dr. Henderson, why is Mississippi on the bottom of every major statistical category that we don't want to be on the bottom of?
Well, it's very simple, Mr. Socrates. It is by political, economic, and Christian design. The people in power, I call them the European Americans, control politics in Mississippi. They control the religion, and they control the industries in this area. They've gotten to the point now where they have said, we are not going to have any black people in Mississippi in a statewide job, and we don't want any to be regional executives like congressmen or people on the road commission or anything. And a good example, we have a congressman now named Benny Thompson, Representative Benny Thompson. He is very forceful. He's been in the same position for years. And he has not been controlled by white folks as they thought they would. And since they couldn't get him to change and be one of their lackeys, they've decided recently that we're going to get him out of office. So he had more people in his district than the other representatives. And they were so kind to Mr. Thompson, they gave him 4 additional counties. And if you look at the design of those counties, they inserted as many Republicans as they could. And he already had, I believe, about 18 or 19 counties. And he almost lost his election a few weeks ago because of that new design to get him out of power. It didn't work, but it almost worked. And since he did win, his opponent says we're going to have to challenge that. We want to have a new review of the voting, and I think I might have won. And if I didn't win, we're going to find some irregularities and have another election. And that's exactly what they're working on now. So if I tell you that economically, politically, and socially, black people in Mississippi and the South are going to be in a worse situation in about 10 years, you will find it's headed in that direction.
Well, Doc, black folk haven't led the state of Mississippi to the position that it's in. That leadership has been solely the responsibility of our European brothers. And they have led us to this position. Now, is it that their hatred of black men is so great that they would keep themselves down just to hold black folk down? Can it be that much hatred in the world to make you act that way? Or is it that they were just inept? They just did not know how to build a strong economy, how to elevate the entire population, how to take advantage of their rich history in terms of tourism, in terms of music. You know, Mississippi is the birthplace of the blues. Others may claim it, but you go into Delta where you were born, that's actually the birthplace. That's ground zero for the blues. And yet, we have all of these things, and we're last. And I can't blame that on black people. And so it's something going on in Mississippi in our white brothers here and sisters that keep doing the kinds of things that make you stay on the bottom.
Well, that's very simple. the white man, or the European Americans, and especially those in the South. Now, this is what I call a 50-state deal. White men know that they are the only people that have any significance in America because they have codified documents called the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, that said specifically that America, or this new land, is the land of white people with property, and especially the males. Everyone else, blacks, Native Americans, are insignificant, and they were not even considered as human beings during that time in the 1700s, in the 1800s, in the 1900s. And they were so strong, they put a constitution and approved one without Bill of Rights where they would address the interests of all those millions that were born here in America. And then they fixed it where, even though we have civil rights, that a black person will never get in a position of responsibility unless we allow him to do it, and we're not going to do it but 1 or 2 times. When things get bad economically, socially, or politically, when black people start burning things, fighting and killing people, we'll then go and massage them a little bit and put a few blacks in positions of responsibility, but we're going to control those. They've done this in a few states. If you look at the history, they got a few black governors in Virginia and other places. They got a few black senators, few black members in the House of Representatives throughout the country, except in Mississippi. I'm not talking about doing slavery. They had some blacks in those positions then, but they were totally inappropriate because they did not have the power to do anything, because they only stayed in power 7 to 9 years. And you can't do anything in 7 to 9 years if you don't have the majority vote. And they didn't have that.
Now, we got trouble in the land. There's trouble in the water. There's trouble in Mississippi. Most of you are aware that we had a tremendous ice water storm. We had a situation where we lost control of our plant, that drinking water plant. And Mississippians, Jackson, were out of water for several weeks. And the world responded. Water was sent into Jackson, Mississippi from all over the world. We had more bottled water in Mississippi than we had in the reservoir. And during that period in time, we had a tremendous debate and struggle between our state leadership and our city leadership. Our governor said that the Jackson leadership was inept, incapable of managing the water plant, and that he would rather be anywhere than in Jackson, Mississippi. He pointed the finger at the African-American leadership and said he didn't know when, if they would ever run the water plant again. The mayor of the city of Jackson cried out that Jackson had not received any funding from the state of Mississippi as they had requested over the years to help prevent and circumvent this problem. He said if Jackson was funded in an appropriate manner, that Jackson would have the revenue and the resources to take care of his water plant. The mayor continued on to say that the state of Mississippi does not pay any taxes on any of the properties that they own inside of the city limit. Yet Jackson has the responsibility to provide fire protection and police protection for all of those citizens. And so the city continues to suffer. And the bickering and the backstabbing and the fighting between the mayor and the governor continues. It continued to a point that the president of the United States called down in Jackson, Mississippi to see what was going on and said that he was going to make every available resource available to Jackson during this water crisis. And so the struggle continues. The EPA Secretary, Reagan, has been down to Mississippi more than 4 times already, trying to mediate between the white state leadership and the black city leadership to try to get us to work together, to come together to fight a common problem. We're so busy pointing fingers at one another that we don't want to see either one of us survive and thrive. We can't come together and say this is our Mississippi, that when one is hurting, we're all hurting, that we're going to share the resources, we're going to fix the problem. But we can't get our folk to do that. Now, Dr. Henderson, Mississippi is a welfare state. By that I mean, for every dollar that we send to Mississippi, we get over $3 back from the federal government.
That's correct.
Yet Mississippi is one of 13 states that will not accept Medicaid expansion that would bring billions of dollars into the poorest state in the nation.
Well, that's good in their mind frame. The people that have control of the policies in Mississippi want to keep it just as it is. It would be an economic disgrace to get all the people in Mississippi healthy. It would be an economic disgrace to have free and equitable education in the state where the young people can get the monies they need to get tutors when they're in the first, second, third, and fourth grade. It's a disgrace economically if the power structure will allow the high schools to do like they did 40 and 50 years ago, to have a lot of vocational technical programs in the high school, so when you finish high school you can get a job that will pay a livable wage and you can raise a family. It is a disgrace where the independent black people, and I'm talking about the preachers now, could have their control over their religion. So some of the religious leaders in the predominant class, the Methodists and others, and the Catholics, have told many of the black preachers, you need to resolve or dissolve your denomination and you come and join us. And we will own your church. We will give you some governance in our religious denomination, and you pay tithes to us. And some of these black preachers are doing that. They're moving and dissolving their religious denominations where they are in charge, where they're getting all the money, and they are breaking away, many of them by the hundreds, all over America, going to the white denominations. The Baptists, the Methodists, and the Catholics are begging for blacks. And just because everyone wants to be like their enemy and love their enemies so, and believe in one religion, in one politics, they are abandoning themselves and causing our situation to become worse than it was during slavery.
You know, they ran a little study years and years ago that they put some little white dolls and black dolls in an elementary school and asked black children to choose one. And 80% of the black girls chose the little white doll.
They'll do the same thing today. If they would put them in the same study, it might be 80% this time, unless the doll looked like one of those famous Gucci dancers or one of those famous female singers. Otherwise, they would do the same thing at a higher degree.
So if our preachers are abandoning their own churches to assimilate, to move in, to try and become, compromise the principles that we fought for, that's black, the ability to determine our own destiny, the ability to have full first-class citizenship. And Doc, I don't believe black folk understand what full first-class citizenship means.
Well, they don't because they never had it. But now they have the knowledge and the training to make it happen. All they have to do is train their own people where they are, and especially the young people. You train your people where they are with your resources, create your own leaders, and you start in the church. First, of course, you start in the home with your personal children. Then you teach them that you are first. Self first, family second, and community third. And you train your people in the church institutions. We don't have that in America of any significant manner. But in Mississippi, churches now can start their own schools and money can follow the students, but many pastors don't want to do that at this time.
Well, there's a tremendous debate about whether money ought to follow, state money ought to follow private schools. The children that go to private schools ought not be able to get state funding to attend private schools. And that war is raging in Mississippi right now because we have these charter schools. And you have to be real careful here. We want to have the highest standards that we can for our children so that they can learn and they can compete, but we don't want to lose control. We saw what happened during the period of integration. We understood what happened, what was the difference that was a student that went to an HBCU versus a student that went to a predominantly white school. We saw that the HBCUs were training leaders and developing character and principles and allowing the students to practice leadership skills and development. In the predominantly white universities, they were playing football and they were relegated to the back of the class, and they were being taught that they were deficient, that they were not equal to the students that they were even in the school with.
Well, you know, the white Europeans in Mississippi, the south of the nation, decided they would do something about that. They noticed that the black colleges and universities were producing excellent students. So they passed legislation in various states that said the top black students at the black high schools can get a scholarship to go to the top white university or college. In most cases, all they had to do is be a valedictorian or salutatorian or be a great football or basketball player. And those leaders, which have been at a black college, would have been the president of the student council, would have been on the athletic club as a leader, would be in the fraternities as a leader. But when they got to the white colleges, they were there as laborers. And the leadership were taken from the black colleges. All of those leaders were taken, put in these white universities. I know a lot of them, and they never rose to the power that they were when they were in high school.
It's akin to white flight. Most white folk moved out of the city of Jackson when Harvey Johnson became the first African-American mayor. We saw white flight take off at that point in time because white folks simply said they were not going to be governed by a black person.
And they still are saying that.
They're still saying that today.
Exactly.
And so they moved out of the city, and Jackson became an 85% black city. But the interesting thing happened there. Then the top 10 of the talent in the black community moved out as well.
Exactly.
And so you take the talent out of the black community and they follow the white folks to the suburbs, and you leave your school system and you leave your industries and you leave your communities void of traditional leadership. And something begins to happen in the community.
All of that is by design, Mr. Socrates. We have studied those issues. The idea is to get the people with money, black and white, from the core areas of the city or the state and get them out of that circle right around the capital, around the big industries. So what they have done historically in Mississippi and the nation, you move into the suburbs. In 5 years or 10 years, then you start moving the factories that's paying above the minimum wage to the suburbs where the people are, and the black people are going to follow. Because those that have transportation and at least a high school diploma or some skills are going to follow the jobs. But 90% of the black people are going to have to stay in the ghetto or around the inner city, and that has been by design because the white people know that in 15 to 30 years we're going to come back when the economic situation is so bad where they can't survive, and we're going to take it over again and kick them out of those areas. And then they can move up to the suburbs.
We're getting ready to go to a station break. You know, Dr. Henderson is pointing out the fact that if you extract the talent out of the black community, and then you incarcerate 10% of the males in our community. Normally, those are the ones that are the entrepreneurs. Those are the ones that are fighting and struggling to try and survive and feed their families by any means necessary. And you lock them up. Then you have a community that is leaderless, and you start to see all of these child soldiers being developed, and you wonder, where did it come from? How did Johnny of today changed so much from Johnny of 10 years ago? How did that happen? It's by design, as Dr. Henderson has said. Today we walk the streets in Jackson, Mississippi, and we see 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds with their pants below their knees carrying Uzis and AK-47. We have one of the highest crime rates in the nation. I think we were the most crime-infested community other than St. Louis last year, with over 154 murders in a city where 20 years ago we didn't lock our doors, that we shared with our neighbors, that we knew one another. And if you saw my child doing something wrong, you corrected them, and then you called me on the phone because you knew I was going to correct them again when they got home. We lost all of that. We lost all of that because we lost the talent and the natural leaderships out of our communities. And the leadership that we have today is different. We're going to talk about that difference when we come back after this break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Socrates Garrett Live. We're broadcasting right here from Jackson, Mississippi, in the heart of the Deep South, where it's our prayers and our hope that one day the South will rise again and it'll look a whole lot different than the last time. We are greater than 40% of the population in the great state of Mississippi. In Jackson, Mississippi alone, African Americans represent over 85% of the population of this capital city. It is time for African Americans to step up and take their rightful leadership position in this state. Of all of our department heads in the state of Mississippi, of over 100 department heads or more, we don't have any African Americans. We don't have any statewide elected African Americans in the state of Mississippi, and we represent 40% of the population. You got to ask yourself, why? You got to go and ask yourself, wouldn't it be better if we were the champion of diversity and we showcase the fact that we have more African Americans than anywhere else in the country? Wouldn't that make us a unique city and state that others would dream about coming to. Why don't we build the Black Wall Street in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, of all places? Why don't we create jobs and opportunities? We have everything in front of us. Our leaders are letting us down. The effective leadership is what's required. And Dr. Henderson said earlier, black folks control over $1 billion in the economy in Hinds County alone. And yet African Americans get less than 2% of contracts for goods and services from our state, and less than 10% of contracts for goods and services from our county, including the city. That has to change. Now, we were talking about why Johnny is so different today than he was yesterday, just before the break. And Dr. Henderson, you asked me if I recall something called CCC.
Yes.
Which I do not, but I'd like to be enlightened.
Well, there was a program right after the so-called Depression in 1929. We had something in America called the Depression, where prices went out the limit. You had rationing, gas carts, and all kind of thing. The war was over, and people didn't have anything. Many people were in soup lines. So the government decided that since we were going to have some major problems in America, too many starving, hungry people running around, they set up something called the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they got the black boys and the white boys out of the South and many other states and put them in camps, just like the military. They were the black boys and white boys that were not able to get in the military. They didn't need them after World War II during that Depression area. So they put them in those camps, paid them a little something called a minimum wage, and they were able to stay in there and learn some skills. They worked in the forest. Many worked in factories. They did any kind of job that they could do to make a little money because they were dependent on the government. And they were able to send money home to their parents. They were segregated, though. Some of the white boys that were in these camps were able to get a little education training, but the blacks worked and played cards and had good times after work, spent all their money in the nearby towns, and they didn't learn anything significant because the trades they were getting in the forest, cutting woods and weeds, clearing out the forest area to keep the fires limited. That's what they did for several years. It is sort of like the new version, they call that the Job Corps. Now, the new version, where they will let poor blacks and whites and others join a little federal program, pay them a little money, give them a chance to learn a trade, and at the same time get a GED. And many of those young people were successful. I worked in that system for 4 years in 4 different states. But those young people, in many instances, didn't succeed as they should have because they didn't have the proper education when they got into the Job Corps program. And many came at the behest of the court system. They were sentenced to prison or to the Job Corps. And many of them had felonies, and they wouldn't allow them to join the military, even though many couldn't join because they didn't have the education status. That's the new prison. And most of those young people didn't finish the program, and I'm telling you from experience. But they did get a literal training. For instance, they can study air conditioning and heating, plumbing, auto mechanics, nursing assistants, learn how to be a clerk, take what we call beginning computer training. And many of those left without a certificate or a diploma, but they could enter into a little job as a clerk and not have to push the basket at the grocery store. They could be a clerk. That helped a little bit. Now, that has been diluted. They still have about 100 Job Corps in America, but the funding has been cut so until they're not significant as they were 30 years ago.
So, Dr. Henderson, you mentioned CCC and you mentioned the Job Corps program, and naturally we always talked about the military. You and I are both veterans. And we had routes to get out of this urban ghetto, to get out of this condition that we were in as boys beyond the state of Mississippi. There were things that we could do to get out of here and make a better life and see the world. Black boys of today don't have those opportunities. The military was a major means of elevating yourself and your family and escaping your conditions.
Exactly.
You didn't have to have an education to do that. You had to have the ability to pass a few tests, and you could volunteer and go into the military.
Let me tell you what ability you had. You had the ability to take the test. You didn't have to pass it. What they required when I went into the military, that you have to have 10 fingers, 10 toes, and be able to have enough English to say, yes, sir. Because they needed us to fight wars so we can get killed. Because they had millions of poor whites and poor blacks that they could call the next day and replace us. So that's what they had. Now they have another system for black boys, and that system is probably better than the military, because now they had an educational system set to the point where most of the black youth, unless they're in what we call the top 10%, not going to finish high school in the first place in America, most now, not going to do it. 55% of black young males in the urban areas and the lower rural areas do not finish high school. So those guys have a training institution already set for them, and you hear and read about the studies, they decide who will be going to prison after they look at the 4th grade count. And those guys have great opportunities. Most of them going to end up in the state jail. First, they start them in juvenile detention, the city and county jails, and then prison. They'll be in there by the 1,000. We have more of those folks in the prisons now than even Russia or China. More black Americans are in jail than any nation in the world.
That's terrible.
That's terrible.
That says a lot about racism and an unfair judicial system in this country. And the judicial system has been the weapon of white privilege from day one. The Klan was actually organized and led by your sheriff's department.
In most cases.
In most cases.
And the corporate leaders in those respective counties and cities.
And so this judicial system, this farce of a judicial system, has hurt black folk more and taken more black men out of the family than any other system. The lack of opportunity and the lack of education is a critical deficit for us. But to be locked up because you had 2 ounces of marijuana and serve 80% of your sentence, or because you, like George Floyd, is accused of stealing 2 Skittles and end up dead, or you're locked up in prison, this judicial system has been out of control for a long time. In Mississippi, it's been notorious that the sheriff that we've had just been real notorious folk, like the sheriffs up in Madison County, and the sheriff down in Simpson County, Goon Jones, and folk like that. They reigned terror in the state of Mississippi for years and years and years.
Well, that's because those sheriffs had no interest in doing what was fair. To be a sheriff in Mississippi and Alabama and most of the southern states and many of the white ones, all you had to do is be a white male and be at least 21 years of age, no education requirements, and no other skills other than having the ability to put on a weapon and whip black folks side to head. Had no skills whatsoever. So those guys I call those heaven jobs, where you can get a white male, 21 years of age, make him sheriff, and he didn't have to have but a third-grade education. Matter of fact, he didn't have to be able to read or write because he was smart enough to get somebody on force that could do that for him.
He had one criteria that he must submit his oath to.
That is, whoever put him in office, which was the white voters, and the county district attorney, and he was supposed to whip people, beat them side the head, and put them in jail. I used to be one of them. And I worked as a police officer in the 1970s. I had no training whatsoever. The first day on the job, they gave me a pistol, a blackjack, some bullets, and some handcuffs. Gave me about 15 minutes of training and put me on a beat with a trainee and told me what I could do and couldn't do.
And most of the things that you could do was to protect their way of life.
Exactly right.
And to make sure that nothing changes here.
Exactly.
You know, that the economy, we certainly don't want to address that because we're not going to share the dollars with you now. White folk will tolerate integration, interrelationships in marriage. They will tolerate some of those things. But you will not tolerate you fooling with the economy, not
right.
his money.
Exactly. Let me tell you, now this is a fact. When I was a police officer, the first 10 minutes of training that I had, they say, your job is to be on patrol. I was a night and weekend officer. You're not to arrest anyone that you think drinking whiskey if you don't see a whiskey ball. If you see someone out smoking dope, if you smell it, that's all you can do is just think they are smoking dope because marijuana was becoming popular then. You're not going to arrest those folks. They also told the black officers, if the white folks, the white youth, get in trouble, because we had segregated schools at the time, you call the police chief at home, or if you know them, and we knew most of the white kids in the area. We knew they were John Doe's sons or daughter. You let them go. Put a ticket and let them go. But you never arrest those folks. Now, that was in the 1970s. In the 1970s. That was all over the area. And then when they got to black police officers in these little towns, even in Jackson, Mississippi, they didn't have police cars. They couldn't arrest whites, and they were walking beats. And they told them to keep those black folks in line. They started off with 2 in Jackson, Mississippi, and I believe they got a couple more. And every time they arrested a white person, which they didn't arrest, they just called the white cops and said, that white boy over there is doing something.
They could not arrest.
Couldn't arrest.
They could just hold a person
That's
until
right.
the white police officer.
But they couldn't hold him with force.
We're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi. You know, we've been seen on Roku TV, on YouTube, on Facebook, and our very own website, WeBelieveDigital.com. Now, we're going on and on and on about what's wrong in Mississippi and what's wrong in the world and the status of Black America. I think in this last 5 minutes, though, we want to shift gears and we want to talk and make sure that everybody understands what is it that black folk really want. They just want to complain and moan and groan. What is it that we really want? Some say, you know, we need reparations to pay for the damages that have been done for those that have been descendants of slaves. And I say descendants of slaves because all black folk are not descendants of slaves. But those that are descendants of slaves are entitled to reparations in some form or fashion. We believe that. But more than anything else, what we really want is just full first-class citizenship. Then you don't need the voting rights laws. You don't need the 14th Amendment. You don't need anything. We just want the same rights that whites have enjoyed in this country since the beginning of time. Full first-class citizenship. The first time I heard the cry for full first-class citizenship was with James Meredith. I asked him, I said, why did you take it upon yourself to integrate Ole Miss in a time where The Kennedys had to send down the National Guard and the Army to escort him into Ole Miss. Shot down on the streets in his marches. His whole family paid a tremendous price. His entire family was unable to get a job in Mississippi. And just like Dr. Henderson and I are talking here today, there are those out there today are deciding on how they're going to shut us up. We get that. We understand that. But if we don't take a stand now, if we don't say that black folks are entitled to full first-class citizenship, then we're doomed anyway. We're doomed anyway. So we're crying out. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that we have the same earning power. We have the same quality of life, that we live in the same kinds of neighborhoods, that our schools are in the same, teaching the same curriculums with the same levels of doctoral programs, that our air is as clean, that we don't pay more for grocery. We just want to be treated the same way that others have been treated in this country. We want a judicial system that's not biased, that's fair. We just want full first-class citizenship. We don't want to live in fear. We don't want to have to worry about whether or not our sons or daughters are going to come home tonight after being out. We don't want to live in those conditions. We don't want to live in food deserts where there are no restaurants and there are no food that's available to citizens like we have here in South Jackson. After 9 o'clock in the evening, you can't find any place to eat in South Jackson. Not today. Even though we're 85% of population, we don't have any black-owned restaurants in Jackson, Mississippi. Sweetie Pie moved down, and Bully's is a traditional restaurant here in the city. We appreciate that. But that's not representative of what we need in this community. We want clean drinking water. We want a wastewater treatment plant that runs and functions properly. We want to replace all these broken water lines and eliminate all of these potholes. We want the same benefit that the state of Mississippi receives but does not distribute into the African American community. They deny us full first-class citizenship when they do that. And so, Dr. Henderson, we're coming to the end of the program. But you know James Meredith.
I know him well, yes.
You know the sacrifice that he made. What do you think his motivation was for integrating Ole Miss?
Well, I've read some of his books. He had one objective. He said, my family had been in Mississippi for generations. I am a Mississippian, I am a citizen, and I deserve the right to get an education at the #1 university in the state, and I'm going to do it. And he did. He had a lot of hard times to get there. He first had to get a recommendation from some white people to get accepted. Then when they found out he was black, they denied him. Then he had to go and spend money that he could borrow, beg, or get donated to get lawyers to fight to get into school. Then when he won that battle, he went to the door and they wouldn't let him in the door then because he was black. And that's when they sent those military folks in to get him in. That's why I've always said, James Meredith is the smartest, the brightest, and the bravest man in America today, and he is still alive. He went against millions of black people, millions of white, and say, I'm going to stand alone. And he went up there, and I could see some of those pictures in my mind now, where he was walking the class, surrounded by FBI agents, Secret Service people, the military. They put him in a dormitory wing by himself. He would go to class and sit up there like a man, one of the best dressed students in the class, ignored most of the time. But he was respected. And the man graduated with a degree. He didn't do like the black kids now that would get a chance to go to some of these colleges and have a tough course, and they change their major. They get in 15 hours of class to drop it down to 9. And most of them are on student loans. Then they have already spent the money, and the school will say, you owe me $1,500 to get back into the next semester. They don't have it, so they drop out. Then they can't even go to the black university then because the transcripts have to be referred to the black university. And in order to get at that, they have to say, I have not done anything but finish high school. I have not been to college. And they have to start again as a freshman, and they've already been in college for 2 years or 2 semesters. Many of them get away with that. A lot of people don't know that. But that is the way it is, because the parents are not teaching their kids to be honorable students in kindergarten, middle school, high school. They don't demand, as I told you yesterday, that the kids make A's and B's. They have no curfews, very few study periods at home. They allow kids to do anything they want, go on visits during the week, unlimited television and telephone during their study periods, have no family meetings where they talk about their problem and successes at least once a week. They don't eat together. So the parents don't even know the children, nor the children know the parents. And most of the kids in Mississippi and in the black communities throughout the United States don't even have 2 parents in the home. History shows, and the records show, and I know this is it, that 75% of the black kids are living in what we call a fatherless home. Parents never married. And then the parents that have them from 17 to 25 usually give those kids away to their grandparents or great-grandparents. And they go out and still have more. I have relatives like that, and you do too. This is prevalent in the black communities in all 50 states. It's getting worse, sir.
It's getting worse. We've exhausted all of our time today. We'll be back next week. We're going to continue the dialogue. We're going to continue to sound the alarm. You know, somebody's got to speak out. You know, if that falls our lot, then we must take up this cross and we must carry it as far as we can until the next generation decides that it's their turn to stand up, to stand in place for the community, and to get beyond the division that we are currently seeing in our community. Now, I'm going to close this show with some comments that I want to make specifically to our elected officials here in Jackson, Mississippi. You know, during the water crisis, it was obvious that the state had the goals of taking over the water plant from the city of Jackson, one of its most prestigious assets. If you take away the water plant from Jackson and take that revenue away, then this city will get poorer and poorer and poorer, and eventually it will go bankrupt. And when it goes bankrupt, then the governor will appoint new leadership, and all of the black leadership in the entire city will be set aside. And this city will be governed by all white folk. Now, that was obvious and that was clear that the state had ill intentions during these negotiations on this water plant. We've seen recently where they wanted to take over our airport, and we had to fight that in court. So the war is on for Jackson. Now, what bothers me a great deal is that the federal government, President Biden, stepped in and said that the full force of the federal government is with the city of Jackson. We stand with you to fix this problem with your water. And he sent down Secretary Reagan here from the EPA to negotiate some terms with our governor and our mayor to come up with a plan to revitalize and rehabilitate and replace and repair this aged water distribution system. Now, one of the main complaints from the state leadership was that Jackson didn't have qualified operators at the plant. So the mayor and the EPA decided that they would hire 4 Class A operators to run the drinking water plant. The mayor brought that order before the city council to hire 4 Class A operators to run the water plant to keep the state from taking it over. 3 of the African American council people did not attend the meeting and would not vote on that historic decision. We just cannot have that kind of division in black leadership. 2 weeks later, less than 2 weeks later, the next meeting of our city council was to accept the plan of the EPA to provide oversight and administer of the water plant and to provide funding for the rehabilitation of our system. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. The same 3 African American council people did not attend the meeting to vote to accept the EPA's generous offer for our city. And when you have individuals that have problems, whatever their problems may be, but their problems are more important than the livelihood and the safeguard of 150,000 citizens in Jackson, then we got a problem. And we saw the same thing with the garbage contract in Jackson, where an African-American business person was the low bidder but could not receive a vote to award him the contract from our black elected officials in the city council. We got to ask ourselves, what kind of leadership is this? If our council people won't support the EPA in its generous offer to provide funding and oversight direct to the city of Jackson, not going through the state, if our council people can't support that, it means that they would rather see the state take the city over. And if they continue to act that way, I'm certain that the EPA, Secretary Reagan, President Biden, will wash their hands of Jackson, just like Pontius Pilate did with Jesus. We cannot have this kind of failed leadership. Whatever your problems are, to Kenny Stokes, Aaron Banks, and Vernon Hartley, the 3 council people who did not attend either meeting, whatever your problems are, they're not larger than the safeguard of this city. And so we ask you to either step up, represent the city, do what's in the best interest of the city, or to step down and say that I'm just unable and unwilling to work in this environment and let someone else have an opportunity. If you can't do that, resigning seems to be the only honorable thing to do. Now, this has been Socrates Garrett Live, and we'll see you next week at the same time. Good night.
Mike's off.